I'm Scott Farber, the podcast Roemer. Niels Roemer, Interim Dean of the School of the Arts and Humanities, Rabin Professor of Holocaust Studies at the University of Texas at Dallas. Professor, welcome back. It's been a while.
No, thank you for having me. Thank you for giving me my whole complete title. You could have added on father of four, owner of two dogs, or something like that.
Let me tell you something. Your title is a mouthful.
I know. I appreciate it.
I think you're just probably making fun of me for my 15th take to get it all in.
No, I think it was all good. That's what I'm saying. How about owner of two dogs or something like that? Put in there.
Well, we wanted to talk today about protesting because in the history of protesting. And, I started to research a little bit so I could possibly ask an intelligent question every now and then.
All righty.
And I realized how long protesting's been going on, how many protests there are. And so, I went back to the women's right to vote.
Sure.
They started protesting decades before the Civil War.
Yeah.
And they got the right in 1920. So let me ask you the first question. Do protests, do they matter?
Well, you picked a good example right from the top. So the women's movement, the suffragettes, if it wouldn't have been for their demonstration and their protest, chances are that, the US would not have granted women voting rights, and neither would have Great Britain, and nor would have Germany done that at the time. So it was largely due to individuals like Emily Pankhurst and others who actually protested in a way that was, at the time, made people quite uneasy because it had forced the British into imprisoning some of these demonstrating women who then refused to eat. And so that, created this cat and mouse constantly of whether to force feed them or not, but it really forced the issue. And that's, in a way, in a nutshell, what do you want to accomplish with protest? You want to force the issue. You want to really, overcome an impasse where you think whatever is so dear to your heart, nobody cares about. And by protesting now, you're not changing it, but you're opening it up for change. You're kind of entering possibly the beginning of a conversation or possibly something that could look like negotiations.
So when people were protesting years ago, did they feel that they were going to make an accomplishment today? Or did they understand that this was going to have to become, it was going to have to evolve over years?
I think the women in particular, they probably had a good sense that what they were striving for was not going to come overnight. And they also had a sense of, when to protest and when not. So very famously, the women in 1914 stand down. When Great Britain goes to war, they hold all protests and say, at this moment, we cannot go any further. So they deliberately prolong, so to speak, the second status by not pursuing it for a while. So no, I think protest has built into it the assumption that it's a process. It will take some time to accomplish.
Well, I know they do protesting for various movements all over the world. And here in the United States, we might not be as up to date on the information on something going on in Europe. But it seems that anything going on in the United States is known all over the world. Why is that?
Well, for one, you could say the United States is a fairly big and important country. So do you want to be constantly updated about Liechtenstein or the US? That's right. So in that respect, I think there's a lot to be said about why people are interested in the US. But I think it's also conversely true that people elsewhere have, more of a kind of constant look outward and are less focused just, in the more narrow sense on their own national culture. So these days, if you follow the UK news or the German news, you learn about as much as about what is happening in the United States as if I turn on the news here in the United States. So I think, right now everyone feels that everything in the United States is kind of coming to an head, and that we're really possibly at a really critical moment in our history where change might happen on a larger scale.
Now when I was a kid in the 60s,
Ah, the 60s.
huh?
Ah, the 60s.
The 60s, an interesting time.
And an interesting time.
I remember having dinner with my older sister and my folks in 1968 with the Democratic Convention in Chicago, and I was living in one of the Chicago suburbs. And I just remember my father looking at both of us and saying, "Neither one of you are leaving the house."
Well, but that's it's we all have our own kind of experiences of things. I mean, for starters, I think sometimes protesting seems to have such a bad reputation. There's nothing wrong about it. It is actually protected by our Constitution. First Amendment comes before everything else. So there's really nothing unconstitutional or undemocratic or unbecoming about protesting. And I grew up in a time where protesting was quite fashionable. I mean, if you wanted to be a cool kid, you demonstrated, and
Well,
I also remember I was acceptable to my parents. I mean,
yeah,
my mom, bless her, she always, when I went demonstrating, and she saw me, she said, I've dinner at home. Don't worry, she might not have endorsed what I was trying to do, but it was acceptable. There's nothing wrong about.
Well, what you're saying is true. It was fashionable, and they kept trying to portray that it was peaceful. But there was, I was looking as I was just researching because I was interested in the Vietnam era. The protesting, they wanted that to be peaceful protesting. But in 1967, there were riots in Detroit that started. Over 340 people died. I'm looking at my stats here. 1,400 buildings burnt down. Over 1,000 injured, I guess. How does it get out of hand? What happens? What's the trigger?
I think it's not always predictable exactly what it takes for things to get out of hand. But I think it is usually the dynamic really between the police forces and the protesters. And I think that's where things can really escalate. And things also tend to escalate the more frustration is in the air and the more nobody comes fresh to the situation. If there was already a degree of violence that occurred earlier, it will, bear on whatever else is taken on. But there are numerous examples where something happened that, without any violence. I mean, I'm going to trump everything here with the best of all examples, the Berlin Wall.
Right.
Just came down within a couple of hours, no violence, no shooting, even though there were still guards that had shooting orders. So it can happen. I mean, I remember that time that going into that evening, none of us expected to wake up to headlines, the Berlin Wall is no more. So it can happen, I think.
Well,
it depends on.
Were you still living in Germany at the time?
Yeah, not in Berlin, but I lived in Germany at the time. And, remember the demonstration started shortly after 6 p.m. And by midnight, the West German newspapers were printing the new headlines. The wall is no more. 6 hours, something that marked, the entire post-war period, something that seemed impossible to overcome. All of a sudden, vanished in thin air without a single person being injured, because of violence or anything.
Was that wall scheduled to come down, or was
no,
it
not at all?
so it was the result of that protest?
It was just a result. And, there's a couple of things that happened. There had been ongoing weekly demonstrations throughout the former GDR, meaning the communist Germany, that had constantly undermined the legitimacy of the GDR government. And they were pushed into like a corner. And I mean, the longer story, I have a great lecture about it. You could book this for 2 hours. But the short is that in this kind of uncertainty, they started to rotate the guys around who governed. And the news guy had just come into office. He was interviewed at night on TV and was pushed around by journalists and said, would you ever give your citizens again the right to travel? And he said, of course we will, of course we will. And then they kept on pushing and said, well, when will you? He said, as of now. And the moment he said it, the people started marching on the wall.
Yeah.
And at that point, the thing was breaking down.
So do you think that that was the most memorable protest then in history?
Well, I mean, that, obviously would, being German and all that, that would, be a very partial selection. I think it's right up there with the best, but I mean, the March on Washington, it's got to be a competitor. If you want to go for the best or most transformative protests ever, Mahatma Gandhi is probably somewhere in the middle. So I think, and these days, I mean, what we're experiencing is, I think, fairly unprecedented. We've had now ongoing demonstrations in this country for a considerable amount of time. And if anything, we have, I think, for a very clear sense that this issue of racism is not going to go away right now, because it seems to kind of go everywhere now. I mean, who would have thought that now universities, the likes of Princeton or Cornell or Harvard, are revisiting the naming of some of their famed halls and are changing the lineup of their famous monuments and the likes. We had this debate a couple of years ago, you remember, here in Texas,
Yeah.
as well as elsewhere in the South. And while there was a wider public debate, it didn't really move the needle. The monuments largely stayed where they are. Now they're moving, and they're moving quickly.
Right. Well, this is for the first time in my lifetime that I can remember where I feel like there is progress being made because of the protesting. It just feels different,
Yes.
and there are some results starting. Well, and then we had the biggest, I don't know if you call it a protest even, but the Women's March on Washington in 2017 was the biggest march in history, they said.
Right. Yeah.
But then I go, but was anything accomplished?
Well, I think, that's sometimes, it has a way of, did it happen? Did it accomplish anything overnight? No. But I think what it did generate very quickly was the sense that there would be multiple Americas for a while to come. And that there would be a constant opposition that would be quite vocal, and that would have as back really grassroots organizations. And in many ways, what you see nowadays with the demonstrations, I mean, the ones that I attended here in Frisco, it's like kids and neighbors that organize it. And I think it's that sense that has come from the Women's March, that you matter and that you can organize something, and that you don't have to have a major organization. You don't have to have membership. It's just everyone can, if they want to take their voices to the streets. I mean, most of the people that organized the late demonstrations here on Black Lives Matters, they were like 16 and 17 years old.
Right, right.
And so I think that's actually quite wonderful, because it demonstrates something else that is really important, and that is democracy and the things that we cherish is not a museum. It's a constant, you have to demonstrate, you have to articulate, you have to argue, you have to vote. And so I think that kind of it matters is what all of us got from the Women's March.
Do you think that the younger people today, like the people in their late teens, early 20s, I know you've met my son, and he's so big on blaming me for there not being any climate change happening in the country, and these type of things. Do you think it's this generation really wants to see some changes for the better?
I think so. I mean, this has been the constant theme, and particularly on the side of the environment, that much of the worldwide protest around the environment has been led by very young people, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Europe, Germany, Norway, it doesn't really matter. And I think it makes sense, because we're messing up their future.
Right.
I mean, the clock is ticking for their future,
right.
More so than for yours or mine, right?
Right.
And so I think they very clearly have a sense that, no, if they want to have any futures like ours, right, they got to push for change right now. And therefore, I think the environment will become now one of those dividing issues.
Yeah.
Are you standing for a radical change or are you not? Because there's no more in between. And I think that it's probably right to be that way at this point.
Well, their issues can be, a catastrophe could happen.
Right.
If we don't have some fixes there.
Well, and you could say, not to my doctor's in philosophy, not in other disciplines, but there is a certain correlation between what we've done to the environment and this constant resurfacing of new pandemics now. So they are not entirely unrelated.
Well, let's go back to the 60s for a minute.
Oh yeah, I know you wanted to go back to the 60s,
Well, it was in the 60s and the 70s, we had Abby Hoffman, and their movements, with the hippie movements and anti-Vietnam War. How do you think those protests affected the nation? I know the Vietnam veterans never were treated really well back then. It's better today, obviously, but back then it was very difficult for them because the country was so divided on that issue too. Was there anything that stands out in your mind from those times?
Well, I mean, for starters, it created on the side of the demonstrator, I think, really a kind of culture on its own. I mean, you're asking me about change, think about music. I mean, how much did the 60s change our musical culture? Profoundly, right?
Right.
Did it change it in a more lasting manner? So many would argue that in the end, most of the protesters ended up becoming actually the new CEOs and making it into the big companies and having their illustrious careers and hanging their dreams at the door. There's probably some truth to that. But, some might also therefore now become, they are now respectively the parents or sometimes the grandparents of those that are demonstrating right now. And I think having that encouragement might also make this now much more, plausible. So there's maybe long-term effect. I think the issue of the Vietnam War might not be as divisive any longer. I mean, there is this kind of reconciling that has occurred over the years. But there's also constant strive toward finding again some other part in America's history where we can more comfortably all come together and look back. Think about the Second World War Memorial in Washington. I mean, that was really created as a way of, okay, there was a war where everything was right. We fought the right people. We won. This is like something that we can celebrate. And therefore, the Vietnam Memorial is one about mourning, right? It's a very pensive and very reflective memorial in Washington, and it's mournful. The World War Memorial in Washington is one about heroism and victories. It's a very different one,
Right.
which speaks, I think, to our desire to our needs to hold on to these moments where we thought our heroism, in lots of ways was fully on display and ultimately victorious.
Now, I know he was extremely powerful, but how much did he progress us along? I'm talking about Martin Luther King.
Well, I mean, how much is always a question of how do you measure? Without him, would we have had the civil rights movement? Would we have had LBJ? Possibly not. I mean, is now again what we have, I would imagine, I mean, not that I've lately checked the Amazon sales, but I would imagine that, or the Google hits on Martin Luther King and his famous writings would have undoubtedly gone up in the last 2-3 months. So I think history has its own way of returning over and over again. It's always something that's there for us to revisit. And I would imagine that he attracts probably far more attention now than he had possibly at some point in between.
See, and that was my next question, and maybe you answered it. But I worry that as generations get older and die off, and new generations come on, how much is the historical value still there, or is it forgotten, or is it rewritten? history along the lines? How secure is Martin Luther King's legacy, I guess is what I'm really
I
asking.
think that is, if anything, right now, its place is even more secure than it ever has been because it, speaks again to yet an entirely new generation. I mean, and to a generation that had largely to discover him once again for themselves, these 16 to 18-year-olds.
Right.
So I think, therefore, I'm not so, I think we can all be very confident that Martin Luther King has a very permanent place in America's memory and will not change. I mean, if you go to the Library of Congress, into the arena that's called America's memory, there he is. I mean, you don't have to search particularly high to find him. And so it should be. I mean, the question is more, what do we do with the painful memories? What do we do with that kind of stuff? And it's funny how those who argue now against the, Confederate monuments are attacked as the anti-historicists or the anti-historical ones because it is as if they want to erase history. Maybe there we have to learn something, that the choice should not always be to simply erase a monument or to keep it. There are also other things that you can do about them. You can also create counter monuments surrounding them. You can inscribe them with new meaning. We cannot simply quote unquote cleanse our past and pretend that Woodrow Wilson didn't hold these views. That the first president of the UT system was not also a big advocate for the Confederacy. And, these types of things unfortunately hold true. And I think undoing them in the sense of just renaming halls and just taking out monuments, it might not always be the only answer. I mean, I can just tell you that, from my hometown, we had a notorious monument in Hamburg, which, marching soldiers around and this inscription, "We must die if Germany should live." And it was this really not ugly Nazi ideology. In the end, they didn't blow it up. They put a counter monument just adjacent to it. And so in that respect, we acknowledge that was Germany at that time, but we also are giving guidance and opportunity to embrace another Germany that's right adjacent in the monument. So I think there's maybe a little bit more, shall we call it, creativity that we might also need in how we want to deal with all these legacies, because it's going to be difficult. I mean, take Woodrow Wilson. Otherwise you're going to have some empty blimp, parts in the history of Princeton and the history of the US if you just take it all out. You can't do that.
Right. A lot of asterisks.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Well, what do you think is going to be with the protesting that's going on daily now? Are we going to, is it going to continue? Will it die out? Will it pick up steam? Are we going to have changes made? Are we going to,
I think we have already changes. I mean, the fact that you and I chit-chat about it, the simple fact that you and I know what 8 minutes and 46 seconds mean, the fact that various police forces have already revisited their procedures and have felt compelled to revise them, and if not, have just made them more public. I think we're seeing change on, maybe not, in a satisfactory manner, maybe not quite comprehensively, but I think there's really a sense of change right now. I mean, it was very obvious at UT Dallas. Our police right away felt, okay, they wanted to communicate. They wanted to make clear to us who they are, what their process is. And I think that's a new kind of transparency, a new kind of, this is what we do, these are our procedures, this is what we don't do, and a kind of, dialogue that I don't think we've been too accustomed to, that we as individuals or as a public are in dialogue with police. And I think maybe we are now, and maybe it's at least a start.
do you think that protesting, it seems to me that it's always been pretty organized, to have, a clear topic that they're protesting. Do you think now with the success we're seeing, we're going to see other protesting for other causes just popping up all over?
I would think so. That we are, the question is always how do you do democracy, right? And I think now we're in a phase where part of democracy is not just simply done through election and representation, but also through protest. And I think the manifestation of that now in terms of Black Lives Matters will also be empowering to other groups who will advocate for whatever they want in whatever fashion they see fit.
And now I'm going to switch topics, 180-degree turn on you.
Okay, I'm turning.
What's going to be with this pandemic?
That's a tough one. I mean, in particular, I mean, you and I, we're here in Texas. We started out so well when, the numbers were high in Italy, numbers were, you know, gigantic in Spain, Texas, then New York, here in Texas, all in all, things were looking really, really good. Now, not so much. Now it's almost a reversal. I think yesterday we broke a new record. With 8,000 new cases. We are like at the point where our hospital capacities are really being tested. And unfortunately, the way this works is, it's going to continue like that. There have not been decisive changes 10 days ago that we've made that would suggest, well, tomorrow's going to be better or better. So I think we're going to, unfortunately, have a really, really tough time with this unless we are willing to change our behavior. I mean, I know what it takes. And in lots of ways, it's a nuisance to run around with a mask. It'll be horrendous for us to lecture on the masks, but it does seem to work. It slows it down. So you wear a mask in public spaces, you clean your hands, you observe social distancing, you regulate that. It makes it virtually, hopefully, impossible for any larger gatherings to occur, and you can slow this down.
Right. All right, you're a professor of history.
That's right.
So let's jump into the future and look back. Is sports ever going to make a comeback to where it's as popular as it used to be, or it currently is, even though we're not playing it? Is baseball going to make a comeback? Will football make a comeback? What's going to be?
Always happy to look into the future. I mean, historians have always been called the the backward-looking prophets. So in that respect, you're talking to the right guy here. I can do past and future. I think they're all going to come back. I mean, we're bending over backwards right now. We completed the soccer competitions in Europe in empty stadiums. We're trying anything and then some to kind of maintain these sports. I think they're all going to come back. What I think is more, problematic is right now that we're, in particular, doing it in the small minor leagues of sorts, where there's no guard, no protection. And we're going to have to live with their consequences. But no, I think they all will be back. I mean, I know that all of us are more than eager to return to reality. That's a bit of a problem. And that we right now have to settle a little bit in for the long game here. With our kind of homebound lives of sorts. But I think, they all will come back. There will come a point where we have more effective protections. But also remember, with many others, we don't have foolproof protection. Take flu. Are you getting every year your flu shot? Yes, hopefully you do. So do I. Does that mean that you're not going to get the flu? No. Does that mean that nobody's going to severely be affected by it? No. So society, by and large, finds a way to manage pandemics and to make them more tolerable. But we most often never quite come to the point that we totally eradicate them.
Yeah. Well, Professor, it was a great show today.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure.
We're going to get together soon and do the next edition of Roemer. Thanks a lot, man.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
Thanks so much for watching. Please make sure you like and subscribe right here to our YouTube channel. And if you enjoyed, please share with your friends. And if you want to see our collection of thousands of stories told by the people who live them, please head on over to gbctv.net. Thanks so much.